This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Geographics. I'm your host Karl Smallwood, taking over hosting duties from Eric today because we're covering something that quite literally happened on my doorstep, the Hillsborough disaster, the moment that changed English sports forever. And as with all the videos here at Geographics, this one is based on a script submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That person today being Ben Adelman, who you can follow at the social media links below. I'm also down there. While you're down there clicking things, you can like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. All things I have to say at the start of the video because analytics show the sooner I say them, the more likely they are to happen. Yeah, so let's get right to it. And I should warn everyone at home with a more sensitive disposition, this video covers some quite difficult subject matter, and it also has a rather frustrating middle and some would say unsatisfactory conclusion. So yeah. Also, this subject is of particular interest to me, not just because it happened in the city in which I call home, but also because I studied part of it from university, which I'll get to when it becomes relevant, but let's get to it. Sports have been one of humanity's favourite pastimes since civilization's first formed. It's one of the world's biggest leisure activities, both in terms of popularity and, of course, profitability. Millions of fans pack into stadiums and arenas all over the world each and every year to watch professional athletes play. It's supposed to be fun, a break from the responsibilities of day-to-day life, but whenever large crowds of people gather together in one place, there's always a danger that if they aren't managed properly, people can be seriously injured or killed. This is exactly what happened in 1989 at the Hillsborough Stadium in the English city of Sheffield, the city in which I'm recording this video. Nearly 100 football fans who would gather to watch a big match were crushed to death due to overcrowding, police incompetence, and just general lack of care on behalf of those in charge, with hundreds more injured. This was one of the worst disasters in British history, compounded by a rush to judgment by the public, driven by the media, who blame the fans themselves for their own deaths through their own behaviour. And it would frustratingly take more than 2 decades for the real story to come out that those ultimately responsible for the safety of the crowd had utterly failed in their duties of care, and then covered up their own mistakes with lies and false stories given to the press, who gleefully reported them to the public at large. Hillsborough changed England's most popular sport forever, ushering in a new era of updated stadiums with better amenities and safety precautions. It's also been used the world over as a case study in the science of crowd control to show safety officials what not to do in order to prevent a similar disaster from occurring under their watch. Above all, it's a story of how tragedy can be compounded by injustice. So yeah, it's a very frustrating story, but one that ultimately I wanted to tell because it's fascinating in that way where you, like when you watch like a true crime documentary and you know the guy did it, and it's like you're watching, it's like, but how did they not know that guy did it? It's that. Similar to that feeling. Anyway, but we'll start, as we often do, from the beginning. Calm down, calm. It's time to take a word from today's sponsor, but when we take word from sponsors, I can't do so alone, and I need help from my business anteater. You're 4 feet away. Tell me more about today's sponsor, Squarespace.
Well, Squarespace, as I'm assuming you're aware by now, is a website that you can use to create your own personal website. Anybody can use Squarespace and you can blog, you can engage with an audience, you can sell products, time, or content, or just simply advertise a business.
Yes, and you might be thinking, well, I don't have a business. It's like, well, do you have a social media profile? You know, statistics say that 90% of people watching this probably do. That's advertising you as a person, and wouldn't you rather the thing that's advertising you as a person to the outside world reflect you better than, you know, the layout that the website forces you to choose?
Well, if you do have a social media and you want to take that to like the extra level, you can use Squarespace's websites to blog.
Yep. And again, you think, well, I don't want to blog. Do you write posts on social media? That's microblogging. That's literally why Twitter started. Wouldn't you like to have more than 280 characters?
So with the blogging tools that Squarespace offers, you can share stories, photos, videos, and updates. You can also categorize and share the posts, but you can also schedule posts,
yes,
which is a very useful tool.
Which is not something a lot of social media profiles let you do unless you have a business account, which usually comes with a whole host of extra issues that you have to do. But, you know, you have to like send off your bloody like passport and stuff, whereas with Squarespace, you just know, you pay the fee, you make your website, and it becomes a repository of everything you'd like to store on there. And that's a useful thing as well. You can use it as a repository of your life. Like, you know, journaling, because it's the new year we're recording this. If you just keep it as a repository of your thoughts of the course of a year, chart your progress on your New Year's resolutions, keep it as just like, tracking your fitness, because once something's written down, it becomes like, it becomes real at that point.
But if blogging's not your thing, you could also set up a store and sell things. Or if you wanted to sell something that wasn't a physical product, you can also set up courses and you can use that to sell your skills, essentially.
Your skills, your time. And you can do that as either a subscription or a one-off.
If you want to take the website a step further as well, no matter what you're doing on it, you can actually add extensions to the website.
I love extensions. I love widgets. I love the word widget. It's widget's such a fun word. Because you know what? That's what you could probably, that's what I imagine this ante would be called. This is widget, and you're like, oh, it's widget. So thank you to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Check out Squarespace at squarespace.com/geographics for 10% off your first purchase of a website/domain using the code Geographics. So as is tradition, at least recently, with sponsored spots here at Geographics, would you guys like an extra bonus fact you won't find anywhere else on this channel? Yay! So did you know that tech journalists would test Nokia phones by throwing them out of windows?
Sounds about right.
Sounds legit.
I don't even need to... So, there is a device out there that is legendary for its durability. And that device is the Nokia 32 and 3310. Well, the Nokia 3210 is the progenitor. The 3310 is like the device that people think of as one of the most durable pieces of technology ever made. And that's something that Nokia, the company, is keenly aware of. And they have one of the most stringent and involved testing processes for their devices, which includes something I like called the gorilla test, which is where they take one of their devices and they hand it to a person who's quite bulky and say, try and rip it apart with your bare hands. And at no time was this more evident than when Nokia decided to release an updated version of the 3310 as a competition for smartphones. They called it the dumb phone. And literally, one of the first things tech journalists who got first access to one of these things did, without prompting, is throw them out of windows. And in at least one case, the reason this happened is because the spokesperson from Nokia handing the phone to a tech journalist when asked about the legendary durability of the original 3310 and whether or not that was being, replicated with this updated version, the spokesman joked that you could throw it out the window without issue, which the tech journalist took as a challenge and immediately threw it out of a window. And for anyone wondering, yes, it worked when they picked it back up. Hillsborough Stadium was already 90 years old as it prepared to host one of the semi-finals of the FA Cup on April 15th, 1989. This was not unusual for a football stadium. Of the 20 teams competing in the First Division in 1989, 18 of them played in stadiums that predated the start of World War I, with the newest among them, for lack of a better term, being built in 1935. Many of these old grounds suffered from crumbling infrastructure, poor amenities, and difficulties in getting fans into and out of them. As an example of how extreme this can be, this is just an addendum from myself because it's very fascinating and was actually a big story last year, at least in the UK. There is a football stadium belonging to Luton FC, where the entrance to one of the parts of the ground literally cuts through a row of terraced houses. And I don't think anything sums up the proximity that row of terraced houses has to the actual stadium, more than the fact residents living in those houses, because yes, people still live in them, than the fact that they report having match officials on occasion knock on their door asking for the game ball back because the players kicked it out of the stadium into their garden. And this became something of a concern to Luton FC when they were promoted to the Premier League, the highest division of English football teams can play in, because it would result in thousands more people coming to their games and they'd have to literally walk through someone's house to get there. But getting back to a topic at hand, many of these older stadiums also had numerous warning signs that they were becoming increasingly unsafe. For example, the old wooden grandstand at Bradford City Stadium actually burned to the ground in 1985 after a single dropped cigarette or match ignited decades of accumulated debris underneath it. 56 people died in that accident. Still, for the owners of Hillsborough, Sheffield Wednesday FC, as well as the authorities, the biggest threat to safety in their minds wasn't the stadium, but the fans. So, beginning in the 1970s, there were increasing concerns about fan violence at football matches known as hooliganism, and it's really fun as a British person to see the word hooliganism in quotes. While the overwhelming majority of fans simply wanted to watch the game, have a pie and go home, there were groups known as firms who attended matches simply to cause trouble. They would fight fans from the opposing team, throw objects onto the field, and even conduct pitch invasions, where they'd storm onto the field and disrupt the game in progress, in some cases attacking the players themselves. And again it's adorable, this is put in quotes here, law and order government of Margaret Thatcher promised to crack down hard on football hooligans, lumping them in the same category as actual terrorists in a 1985 speech. Well, some of the methods to stop hooligans were practical and still used today in a lot of big events, such as not letting people have glass bottles that can be used as projectiles. Other measures were decidedly more extreme, particularly the introduction of tall metal fences that were supposed to prevent fans from being able to run onto the pitch. In addition to keep fans from opposing teams apart, the stands were subdivided into pens with more fencing. In the rush to contain unruly fans who were frequently and unfairly compared to wild animals in press reports, the safety of the crowd was often overlooked, to the point where it was acknowledged at the time that if there had been similar perimeter fences at Bradford Stadium during the 1985 fire, the death toll would have been in the hundreds, if not thousands. After all, it doesn't really take a genius to realise that if you're penning a large group of people up in what amounts to a large cage, it is going to be difficult to evacuate them if an emergency situation develops. You can probably see where this is going. In the 1980s, Liverpool FC was England's most dominant team, winning the First Division Championship 6 times. Their fans were, in general, less prone to hooliganism than other clubs, but Liverpool had one significant black stain on their history. In 1985, fan violence between supporters of Liverpool and the Italian club Juventus during the European Cup final at the crumbling Heysel Stadium in Brussels caused a crowd stampede and the collapse of a wall that killed some 39 people, mostly Italians. The tragedy led to a banning of all English clubs from European competition for 5 years. Liverpool, for the curious, were banned for 6. As a result, Liverpool fans were viewed with suspicion by the police, many of whom believed they were all prone to drunkenness and disorder. And to be clear, it's not myself or the author Ben Adelman saying this, we're speaking from the perspective of the police in the 1980s, who obviously had a warped and unfair view of fans of Liverpool. One of the police policies of containment was to ensure fans from the opposing teams enter the stadium from separate entrances, which is fairly common even today. For example, I live in the city of Sheffield, which has a very fierce rivalry between the two teams here, Sheffield FC and Sheffield United, to the point where pubs that are frequented by fans of one team and not the other will have signs outside on match day saying no away fans, just to avoid any kerfuffles that may ensue. And people get very heated about their sports. At Hillsborough, Liverpool was assigned the Leppings Lane entrance and over 10,000 fans were allocated tickets to the Leppings Lane terrace. Traditionally, football fans did not have seats, but instead stood on terraces, which were concrete steps periodically broken up by crushed barriers, which were supposed to prevent overcrowding. There were no assigned places, and each fan was largely left to their own devices to find his own level on the terraces. Hillsborough Stadium is in a fairly awkward location, pressed against the River Don and surrounded by houses and shops, which, as mentioned in the intro, unless it was cut out, is not uncommon for a lot of football stadiums. The Leppings Lane entrance was a well-known bottleneck, narrow and with fewer turnstiles than other entrances. Like other parts of a stadium, the turnstiles were old, prone to jamming, and fairly slow to operate. Entrance was further slowed by multiple police searches for weapons or alcohol, and as a result, at 2:30 PM, half an hour before kickoff, a large crowd of Liverpool fans were stuck outside trying to get in. As more people piled in behind, the ones in front found it increasingly hard to move. Police on horseback waded through the crowd in an attempt to relieve the crushing, which went about as well as you'd expect, because a 10-foot bobby isn't exactly going to calm things down. So not only did the horses get spooked by the crowd noises, but the crowd became increasingly irate when they were pushed aside and stepped on by the aforementioned horses. So if something wasn't done, there was a serious risk of injuries and even fatalities outside of the stadium. The police match commander for the game was Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield of the South Yorkshire Police. Duckenfield had only been on his job for 3 weeks at this point, after his predecessor had been transferred in the wake of a police hazing scandal. Despite the fact he had no experience policing football matches, he was nevertheless in charge of the nearly 1,000 police officers in and around Hillsborough that day. Now his subordinates called on Duckenfield to make a decision. In order to relieve the crowd crush on Leppings Lane, they needed to open one of the exit gates. Duckenfield gave the order, and at 2:50 PM the gate gate was opened. An estimated 2,000 fans entered the stadium in a matter of moments, most of whom headed directly for the tunnel across from them. Unfamiliar with the stadium's layout, many of the fans likely assumed that this was the only way onto Leppings Lane Terrace, but it wasn't. In fact, it only led to one of two central pens, number 3 and 4, which by this point were already at capacity. In prior years, police and club officials would block off access to the tunnels when the pens were full, pointing fans to the other pens, but this was not done on that day for reasons that will become clear momentarily. The fans walking down the tunnel couldn't see into the pen, so they had no idea they were walking into a quite literal death trap. Human beings need a certain amount of physical space in order to breathe. When too many people are packed together in an enclosed space, the result is what's known as a human crush. People are pressed against each other and against the barriers, preventing them from escaping, the air is forced out of their lungs, their chests compress, and the crushing prevents them from being able to breathe or shout for help. By the time the fans in pens 3 and 4 realised what was happening, it was too late. The pens were now at double their capacity and the people inside were, for all intents and purposes, completely trapped, unable to move because of the press of bodies around them. In pen 3, a crush barrier gave way under the pressure of the crowd and dozens of people piled on top of one another as they fell. Panicked fans began to climb the barriers, separating them from the other pens and the pitch, but initially were forced back by police officers who believed they were stopping a pitch invasion. By the time they figured out what was happening, people were already dead. And this is where the story goes from being difficult to frustrating, so you've been warned. Another thing David Duckenfield could have done was delay the start of the match in order to make sure all of the fans got inside the stadium first, but again, he didn't do this. The game started but was stopped by the referee after just 6 minutes of play. People were now streaming onto the pitch, crying for help. Police at Leppings Lane, now aware there was a disaster in progress, were desperately pulling people out of the pens. Children were lifted over the fences to escape the crush, and other fans were pulled up onto the upper decks of the stands by their fellow supporters. It was, to put it lightly, complete chaos down on the field. Even if there had been a plan in place for a mass casualty incident, it wasn't being followed. Police were not getting any direction whatsoever from Duckenfield up in the control box. The commander is described as having froze at the moment of the incident. Fans who had escaped the pens ended up tearing down advertising boards from around the stadium to use as makeshift stretchers to help their fellow supporters, but it soon became clear that for many, it was simply too late. The crowd was packed so tightly that many victims died literally on their feet. A total of 95 people died in the disaster either on the day or soon thereafter. Over 700 were also injured. The death toll climbed to 96 in 1993 when a victim who'd been in a vegetative state since the disaster was taken off of life support. Another victim of Hillsborough would die of his injuries in 2021 for an official death toll of 97, the worst sports-related disaster in British history. Most of the victims were young people, including 17 children under the age of 18. And I feel that a moment of much needed levity is required here, so it may make people feel a little bit better to know that in the days since, whenever a football match happens to fall on the anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, many football teams from around the UK like to leave 95, later 96 and now 97 seats open on the front row in recognition of those that died that day. That's a nice thought. Getting back to a disaster, shock soon gave way to anger as the public wanted to know how it had occurred, and they soon had their answer. Multiple press reports quoting police sources reported that a horde of drunken ticketless fans had stormed the ground, overwhelming the police officers, and they were responsible for the crush. In arguably the worst allegations were printed in the absolute rag known as The Sun, claiming that fans had, among other things, stolen from the dead, urinated on police officers giving CPR to victims, and that the police officers were physically attacked while rescuing people from the crowds. The report all but confirmed the absolute worst biases the British public had about football fans based on 2 decades of unfair and sensationalist reporting on hooliganism. The fact that the victims were Liverpool fans only added fuel to the fire in the wake of the Heysel disaster. And a piece of context I feel is quite important to add here for Americans is that all of this reporting played into lazy, obnoxious, offensive stereotypes about people from Liverpool and Merseyside, that of them being thieves and criminals, which isn't true and is based on a 100-year-old stereotype that has long since been funny. I don't think it's never been funny. I've got a very close friend from Liverpool who still has people say this to him. Is that wasn't funny in the 80s. And you're saying it 45 years later? Who are you on about? Anyway, what the public didn't know is that all of the allegations weren't just wild rumours reported as facts, they were outright lies, the product of a deliberate misinformation campaign conducted by the senior South Yorkshire police officers in order to deflect blame from their own ranks. Even on the day of the disaster, literally as bodies were being pulled from the pens, David Duckenfield was telling the head of England's Football Association that the exit gate had been forced open by fans who then rushed onto the ground, despite knowing full well that he was the one who ordered that it be opened. The official government inquiry into the Hillsborough disaster was conducted by Lord Justice Taylor, a judge of England's Court of Appeal. His report, published in 1990, laid the blame for disaster at the doorstep of the police, as well as citing poor stadium design and the inherent danger of standing terraces, particularly ones that were fenced in. However, after prosecutors declined to charge anyone with any crime in association with Hillsborough, the families of the victims felt that anyone should be held criminally responsible for the deaths of their loved ones. They turned to the coroner's inquest, which was supposed to determine how each victim had died. They were to be, in a word, disappointed. The coroner, Stephen Popper, appeared to be in lockstep with police opinion about the cause of the disaster. On the night of April 15th, Popper made the, shall we say, extraordinary decision to test the blood alcohol levels of everybody who died, including the children. This had never been done before following a mass casualty event and seemed to reinforce that in the minds of the public that the drunkenness must have played a role in the crush, despite Taylor's report. And it only made things worse when the blood alcohol levels of each victim was read out loud in court during the inquest, which was then published gleefully in newspapers and tabloids around the country. Because I can think of no greater crime than having a pint and watching a match. The inquest jury ruled all of the deaths to be accidental, and the families who formed the Hillsborough Family Support Group felt that a grave injustice had been committed against their loved ones. Not only had they died, but they were being smeared in the press and blamed for their own deaths. They fought back, organising a highly effective boycott of the Sun in Liverpool and Greater Merseyside, which saw the circulation decrease by 80% in the area, a loss to the paper of about £15 million per month. And this is where my educational background comes in, and I can offer a little extra context here. So I have a degree in Media and Communication Studies from Sheffield Hallam University, and I had an entire module on the responsibility of the media and its reportings, and we had an entire month of lectures on the Hillsborough disaster. And something that I found absolutely fascinating is that the people of Liverpool's response to reporting from the Sun and the resulting boycotts might well be one of the singular, most effective and long-standing boycotts in human history. Because even to this day, 35 years later, it is next to impossible to get a copy of the Sun newspaper anywhere in the wider Liverpool and Merseyside area. And I distinctly recall bringing this up when speaking to a friend of mine from Liverpool, and when I asked them, is it really true that you cannot get a copy of the Sun newspaper anywhere in Liverpool? And they just responded, no self-respecting scouse will be caught reading that. And I apologise, that was the worst Liverpudlian accent ever. I promise not to do it again. But that's what they said. And it's just, yeah, even to this day, you cannot get a copy of that newspaper near anywhere in that part of the country. And the part of this that I found so soul-nourishing is that the Sun newspaper is keenly aware that nobody in Liverpool will ever buy that paper ever again, and they have tried multiple times to relaunch the paper in that region of the country, and every single time have been greeted by a resounding You know what, that's a topic for another day. Let's get back to the subject at hand. So meanwhile, the disaster and Taylor report galvanised professional football clubs to put their house in order, so to speak. Clubs in the two divisions of the league were required to convert their stadiums to all-seater models, replacing the standing terraces. The perimeter fencing had to go as well. Pens would no longer be allowed for safety. This occurred as part of a wider effort to renovate the old stadiums, driven by a massive influx of television money that came with the introduction of the Premier League in 1992. Many of the clubs built new stadiums, while others modernised their old grounds. At Hillsborough specifically, the Leppings Lane Terrace was taken out of service following the disaster. When it reopened in 1991, seats had been installed and the fences removed. Both the European Federation, UEFA, and the World Federation, FIFA, followed England's example, making all-seater stadiums a requirement to host any international match. For decades, even as opinions began to change regarding the cause of the Hillsborough disaster, persistent rumours about Liverpool fans being the root of the crush persisted. In hopes of settling the matter once and for all, the government appointed the Hillsborough Independent Panel in 2010, chaired by the Anglican Bishop of Liverpool. The panel's mandate was to review all of the documents about disaster compiled over 20 years, to see how they contributed to the public's understanding about what occurred. The panel's report, published in September 2012, was shocking. The cause of disaster, as stated in Taylor's original report, was an abject failure of crowd control by the police and that the fans played no part in what happened. How were they to know? But it was what came afterwards that was truly damning. It amounted to essentially a complete cover-up by the South Yorkshire police, who not only lied to the press, making up stories of drunken fans urinating on them, but also systematically altering hundreds of police statements to emphasise fan disorder and remove any criticism of themselves. Most horrifically of all, though, it found that as many as 40 of the victims may have survived that day if they received proper and prompt medical treatment, which just didn't happen because of the shambolic response by safety authorities to the unfolding disaster. The report was a vindication of what the families and survivors have been saying all along, and everyone who criticised their campaign over the years has been, to quote, self-pity, we're now lining up to apologise. The Prime Minister at the time, David Cameron, offered an official government apology for not only the disaster, but the way the survivors and relatives of the victims had been treated. As a reminder, for 20 straight years, people involved in the disaster were accused of stealing from the dead. And there actually were photos published in the Sun newspaper purporting to show people stealing the wallets of the dead, when it turns out they were actually dragging them out of the wreckage to help them and get them to safety. Moving on, Sheffield Wednesday Football Club and the South Yorkshire Police apologised, as did the Sun and its controversial former editor, Kelvin Mackenzie, although the latter two were rejected by the families as being, and I quote, too little, too late. In the wake of the report, the original coroner's inquest was quashed and a second inquest was conducted, which ruled in April 2016 that all of the Hillsborough victims had been, and I quote, unlawfully killed as a result of negligence on the parts of both the South Yorkshire Police and Sheffield Wednesday, whose unsafe stadium design contributed in part to the disaster. Today, a large stone monument stands outside Liverpool FC's stadium and field, listing the names of the 97 who died, accompanied by an eternal flame. At Hillsborough, white seats at the front of Leppings Lane stand, one for each victim, are kept empty during games as a constant memorial and tribute to the dead. There are calls from some to turn the whole stand into a memorial, which looks pretty much the same as it did in 1989, except some safety improvements required by the Football Association, but the club, which has been relegated from the Premier League in 2000 and hasn't been back since, has claimed it doesn't have the money to do so. For those hoping that the inquest verdict will result in criminal liability for those judged to be responsible for the deaths at Hillsborough, they were to be again disappointed. I told you this one has a frustrating middle and end. Charges were brought against a number of people in connection to the disaster, but only one was to be convicted. He would be Sheffield Wednesday's club secretary in 1989, Graham Mackerel, who was fined £6,500 for violating the Health and Safety at Work Act. David Duckenfield, who retired from the police force in 1991 for health reasons, was acquitted of manslaughter in 2019. Yeah. The crowds who continue to flock into England's football stadiums each and every year are much safer than they were in 1989 because of the numerous safety improvements implemented in the wake of Hillsborough. Standing sections continue to be banned at the top levels of football in the UK, although the introduction in recent years of so-called safe standing zones, where crowd crushes aren't supposed to be able to happen, have debuted in other countries, particularly American soccer stadiums. Hooliganism, meanwhile, long viewed as the root cause of the disaster, had largely disappeared from the English game by the 2000s, of courts have banned troublemakers from attending games anywhere in the country, and sometimes the world, for years at a time. Most of these so-called firms that still exist largely confine their illegal activities to areas away from the football ground. Although it hasn't stopped people making numerous movies glorifying them, including my favourite, Green Street, starring Elijah Wood, who just comes in and becomes an English football hooligan. It also sounds like a pre-famed Charlie Hunnam, who does the most just exaggerated swag walk I have ever seen in any movie, where he's walking with shirt off and just like proper Vince McMahon gorilla arms. What I'm saying is it's great and you should watch it, but I digress. As Hillsborough unfortunately showed, almost all crowd crushes are the result of poor crowd management, the science of which has thankfully come a long way since the 1980s. However, the lessons learned are not always followed by safety officials, which continue to have tragic consequences. For example, 21 people died as a result of a crowd crush at the Love Parade Music Festival in Duisburg, Germany in 2010. And in 2021, poor crowd control techniques caused a crush that killed 10 again at the Astro World Festival in Houston, Texas. However, the worst crowd disasters in modern times have both occurred since Hillsborough at the annual Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. 1,400 died in a tunnel in 1990, while more than 2,400 died in a bottleneck in 2015. Hillsborough casts a fairly long shadow over Britain as a whole, and particularly football, which remains the country's most popular sport. But even non-football fans in the UK are intimately familiar with the tragedy, since so much of it had so little to do with the sport itself and everything to do with the integrity of public servants, the media, and even the justice system, which is supposed to serve us. It's been called one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in British history, and it's really hard to argue with that assessment. We can only hope in the future, whenever large crowds gather at sporting events or a concert or any other reason, those responsible for managing those crowds remember what happened at Hillsborough, so a similar tragedy never occurs again. So I imagine that this video was a difficult and oftentimes frustrating watch. Reading through the script was equally as frustrating and difficult for myself, and I do appreciate the author Ben Adelman for creating such a comprehensive overview of the whole thing, although I did add to it with my own experience at times, because yeah, it's something I've studied and continue to be fascinated and frustrated by, as is the case for a lot of people in the UK. If you did enjoy the video, as mentioned, you can leave a like, comment with feedback, suggestions, any ideas for future topics you want us to cover down in the comment section below. Subscribe for more content like this, and as always, go out there and have the day that you deserve.